Hey everybody, how's it going? It's a Daily Shooter, and today I want to talk about the Second Amendment. There seems to be some misinformation out there, maybe some uncertainty floating around as to what the Second Amendment actually means, and maybe what shall not be infringed actually means. Is it something that pertains to hunting? Is it something that pertains to muskets only? Well, let's talk about it. Now, while it might seem like this video is kind of preaching to the choir, I think it's sometimes good to step back and look at exactly why the people who are opposing the Second Amendment actually think the way that they do. Now, the Second Amendment seems to be, to the anti-gunners at least, the only amendment in our Bill of Rights that does not evolve. What I mean is, when you take a look at the First Amendment has obviously evolved over time. And it's evolved to cover different things that were not available, different technologies and things that there's no way that our founding fathers could have ever imagined. So when you talk about the First Amendment, when it was first written, you had two ways of communication. You either had word of mouth or you had the written word, and that written word or word of mouth would spread its way through the country over time, and that's how information got out. But they wanted to be able to protect the freedom of the press. They wanted to be able to protect free speech so that people could say what they want without fear of retribution from their country. Now, as we move forward in time, obviously we have the internet. We have telephone lines. We have so many other ways of communication that there's no way that these people could have ever imagined. But with these forms of communication, there's obviously a certain level of First Amendment protection that we have within each of them. I can make a phone call to somebody in New York and I can say that I don't like this or that, or I can talk negatively about my government and I can say whatever I want to that other person. And there is supposed to be no retribution from our government about that because I have the freedom to say that. I have the freedom to say these things. So the First Amendment has covered all these new technologies. I can write an email to my friend and I can say that, I disagree with this, I disagree with that. I can say whatever I want, or at least that's the way that it's supposed to work. So the First Amendment has evolved over time in order to accept all of these new technologies that have come along. Well, the Second Amendment seems to be stuck. These people that think that the Second Amendment was written back then and there's no way they could have ever anticipated that there would be these new technologies like fully automatic or semi-automatic or, magazine-fed anything back then, then how could they have possibly known that they would be writing the Second Amendment to protect these types of guns? And so they look at the Second Amendment and they say, well, even though the First Amendment has evolved, the Second Amendment must be frozen in time. When in reality, that's not the case. So let's say that, yes, they wrote it specifically for the musket. I mean, let's just go ahead and imagine that they wrote it specifically for the musket. Well, the musket was the predominant military weapon of the time. So if they only wrote it for the musket, then they wrote it for the most technologically advanced firearm that anybody individually could hold. So as a rifleman went out and he did battle against the British forces, he had a musket. And he stood up against a tyrannical government with his musket. That was the weapon of the day. Now, the Second Amendment wasn't necessarily written at the same time that the rest of the Constitution or Bill of Rights was written, and we all know that the Second Amendment actually came later on. So there was time to sit down and think and understand exactly what they wanted to accomplish with the Second Amendment. And I think that's why that's the only amendment where it says shall not be infringed, because they realize that when it comes to power, when it comes to tyranny, when it comes to a government can simply infringe on a Second Amendment right by changing the definition or just going around it altogether. And so with a tyrannical government, they all know that a piece of paper is just a piece of paper. Unless you give the people the power to fight back and protect that piece of paper, then it is just a piece of paper. So we have our First Amendment, which protects our free speech. We have our Second Amendment, which protects the document that protects our free speech. Now, people could say they can't do anything because it's our God-given right. Well, we all know that it's our God-given right, but if you look through years and decades and hundreds of years of history, when it comes to tyrannical governments, they don't care about your God-given rights. They don't care about your constitutional rights. They will go ahead and run over a complete society if that's what they feel like doing. More people have been killed by their governments than by anybody else on the face of the planet in the history of time. It's all been done by governments. Our government knew that back then. And they said, look, if we can figure out a way where we can maybe stop the rise of a tyrannical government again in the future, we should probably put that into our Constitution. Do you think that when they wrote that in the Constitution, they said we're going to just protect the government of this time right now? Or do you think that when they wrote that in the Constitution and decided to make it the second of our Bill of Rights, do you think that they wrote that in there to say, we're only going to go ahead and protect you against from tyranny in the next 20 years, in the next 50 years, or we're only going to protect you against tyranny until technology changes? We're going to go ahead and let the society that we're planning right now, that we've put our lives on the line for, that we were called traitors for, that we fought and died for, we're going to put these things on the line 100 years from now or 200 years from now, or the values that we're going to write on this paper today being the Second Amendment, is that still going to stand 200 years from now or 243 years from now, which is today? I think that when our forefathers wrote the Second Amendment, they knew that it was to protect against tyranny, which is what they just fought over, which is what they just fought about, that whole war. And they decided that they were going to take a stand for tyranny for those of us in the future who might experience the same thing. They knew that power breeds corruption. And if power breeds corruption, there's no way to stand up to power unless the people have the power. And the people don't have the power if they don't have the right to free speech and the right to keep and bear arms. It's something to think about. This is not a Second Amendment right that stopped back then, but every other right continues forward. Okay, this right continues forward too, and it continues forward forever. As long as technology, and the government has new technology, the people should have that same technology to make sure that they can fight back should their government become tyrannical and try and overrun them. That's what the Second Amendment is there for. It's actually not for hunting. It's not for self-defense. It's not for muskets. It's there to protect us from the only people who are actually capable of taking all of us out. So no, it is not obsolete. It is not about hunting. It is not about having 10-round mags if your local law enforcement can have 30. It's not about keeping people down to 5-round magazines, 7-round magazines, 10-round magazines, even 15, if the same rules don't apply to the government. Until the same rules apply to the government, then the people should be free to have what the government has. Unless the people have the ability to fight back against the tyranny that the Second Amendment was specifically written for, then it's useless. So every time you hear this musket thing, every time you hear you don't need 10 rounds to go hunting, keep in mind, it has nothing to do with that at all. Second Amendment should be protected just like the First. Anyway, I want to thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. We got to stand up against this. It's just going around the country like wildfire, and it's got to be stopped. So I want to thank you all very much for watching. Please like, subscribe. Make sure you join the Firearms Policy Coalition, is fighting for our Second Amendment rights every day. Have a great day.